Nina Seavey, our newest contributor to the American Conspiracies Project. I haven't had a chance to give you a chance to introduce yourself yet. We've had a couple meetings, but you weren't on the project yet. But could you just tell us a little bit about yourself to get started?
Sure. So I am a kind of, I guess, a little bit of a polymath. I am a documentary filmmaker, a podcaster, an author, a professor of history and media and public affairs at the George Washington University. I founded and directed for 30 years the Documentary Center at George Washington University. And I'm now on the faculty of the Maine Media College and Workshops in College in the state of Maine. And I was the founding director of what's known as Silver Docs, which is the American Film Institute and Discovery Channel launched a decade-long film festival, and I was the founding director and then the executive producer of that festival for 10 years. So I do a lot of different things. I write for scholarly publication, but also a lot for general public interest kinds of publications. We both are authors for the new Left in the Midwest volume. I also published quite a bit in literary journals. So it's kind of I've got a lot of different hats that I wear, all of which I'm very happy to be able to do. I consider it a great luxury.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction. And I just shared my screen here. So let's see, we have this is the volume that Nina referenced, Left in the Midwest, St. Louis Progressive Activism in the 60s and 70s. And both of us are contributors in that volume, which is when we started to learn about each other. And Nina, I could say I just read your chapter this morning. So I walked into my office and I picked it up, and I didn't know that there was that extra bit by Carl Boggs afterwards.
Right, sort of whatever happened to Howard Mechanic story. Yeah,
yes,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And so that was incredibly interesting, obviously. And then I also want to promote your podcast, which I also had the chance to listen to, My Fugitive. And I know you have a lot of work. You're very prolific, and I'm just starting to work through my list of your stuff. But I did get a chance to listen to this, and I recommended it to my partner and some of my friends, and it's really good. It's really good.
Thank you.
This is also won tons of awards, right?
Yeah, we just won another one yesterday. So
Yay!
yeah. So
well,
yeah,
it's well deserving. Can you tell
you.
us what the My Fugitive podcast is about?
Yeah, sure. It's so the podcast initially started with just this kind of small idea of this case that my father, who was a civil rights attorney in St. Louis, I grew up in St. Louis, that he had in 1970. It was the night of the Kent State murders, May 4th, 1970. And there was a large riot on the campus of Washington University in St. Louis. Not surprising, many other college campuses around the nation also sort of went up in, just conflagration as students protested what had been the murder of these 4 students at Kent State. So he had a number of clients, of which a young student named Howard Mechanic was one. Howard and a number of the other students were tried, as many students were, on local charges of, disrupting, disturbing the peace, all kinds of, local sort of slap on the wrist kind of charges, to be quite frank. But for some reason, there was a number of students who came up on federal charges. And this was St. Louis was the only place in the country where this happened, as it evolved, as we come to find out. But no one could figure out why they were being brought up on these federal charges. And it was a charge that was very, very unusual. It had never been used prior to May 4th, 1970, and has never been used since, except until the Trump inauguration day, and they used that same charge again. Just FYI, footnote put a pin in that. Anyway, point being, so my father lost this case, which there was ultimately two of his clients, a guy named Larry Cogan and Howard Mechanic, were both charged with having thrown a cherry bomb, which is a small incendiary device, if nobody knows their July 4th, sort of fireworks, at a policeman. It went off, but nobody was injured. There was a crowd of 3,000 people that burned an ROTC building to the ground on the campus of Washington University. They were not charged with that crime. They lost their case. Both of them were sentenced to 5 years in federal penitentiary and a $10,000 fine, which was absolutely mind-boggling. Howard Mechanic fled and became the second longest fugitive in U.S. history. And Larry Cogan ultimately did not serve 5 years in federal penitentiary. He was sentenced to a mental institution, the St. Louis, the Missouri State Mental Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. He was not a crazy person, but as if we were living in the Soviet Union, he went to a mental institution. Anyway, all of this would have died out had Howard not fled, but all of that sort of kept it burbling up. You'll have to find out what happens to Howard during those 30 years, which we obviously go into, but I became interested in the question of how could this have happened? Like, what was it about this particular case and this particular time that allowed this to happen? My father and I talked about this at great length during his life. And then I decided to become, sort of not the daughter of the civil rights attorney, but the documentarian in this mix, and filed 358 Freedom of Information Act requests, and ultimately had to sue the federal government, the FBI, the CIA, the Department of the Army, and the National Archives for what ended up being 150,000 pages of documents that not only revealed why this happened, but it turned out that there was a connection to the assassination investigation of Dr. Martin Luther King that happened in St. Louis that was related to what happened to those students. And this is what I uncover in this podcast, 8 episodes, all of which, like you listen to episode 1, then you listen to episode 2, and you listen to episode 3, and they seem all very different. And like, how is she going to tie this all together? But they are very intricately tied. All of it has been verified in these documents and by people that you and I are going to talk about in a little bit. But an amazing and sort of unbelievable story.
It's kind of mind-blowing, and you yourself didn't even know what you were getting into when you started this investigation. And when you kind of summarize it like that, it's just like, how can this possibly add up? But as you assure us, it does. And if you listen to the 8 episodes, perhaps you will be convinced as well. But
Well, hopefully you will be, because in some ways it's tied to the work that you and I are doing. So, leave Howard Mechanic and, sort of his drama behind. But in episodes 2, 7, and 8 of that podcast, there is this sort of this sort of parallel universe that I explored that, it shouldn't say parallel because they do come to intersect, specifically in episode 8 of My Fugitive. But what I do is I've separated those out and am now doing a lot more work in that area. And that's what led me to you.
Right. I had a quick question about your dad before we move on. So I saw a cute picture of you and your father sitting down. You're holding, what is that, a glass of wine?
Yeah, I got a wine and he's got a beer.
And he's got a beer, and you're talking on, what is that? Is that your house or?
That was his home.
His home, okay.
Yeah.
And it's, there's a little caption, this is Louis Gilpin and his Gilden and his daughter.
Gilden.
By the way, my child's name, we call him Louis. We go by the French pronunciation.
It's a great name.
Yeah, it is a good name. But does your dad go by Louis? Is that right?
Yes, Louis Gilden. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyway,
that was the only question.
No. That's not the question. That's not the question. Here's the question. I hope this isn't giving too much away in your podcast, but in the intro to one episode, you mentioned that when you told your dad that you wanted to open up this investigation, I mean, what did he say? And I wanted you to I wanted to hear that from you. Like what did he say and how did you feel about that?
Yeah, that doesn't tip. I mean, I don't think that's just any spoiler alert. I mean, I think, it's a legitimate question to ask. My father was very opposed to it. And we actually had quite an argument about it that led to us not speaking to each other for quite some time.
Wow.
Because I was like, no, we need to know about this. And he was like, don't get involved. And I think it emanated from a lot of different emotions that he had, some of which was like, don't touch my stuff. He was a very, very powerful attorney. He argued a very important case in the Supreme Court, Green versus McDonnell Douglas. You hear from Percy Green in My Fugitive. He won that case 9-0. It led to a lot of affirmative action in hiring and employment in this country. So he was a very, very difficult man and a very proud man. But I think he also understood, because he'd been under federal surveillance for so long and had been so harassed by the federal government for so long, that he knew what they could do to you. And I think he was both protective of me, but I think he also, didn't want me to get inside his shit, But that said, at the very end of his life, even long before I ever really had found out what had happened. I mean, the last conversation that we really had, and I kind of recount that story of us having a conversation on that porch where we're, sitting on the steps that in the photograph that you saw. And our last conversation really being about Howard Mechanic and what had happened to our family and what had happened to him because of this unresolved, inexplicable sort of violation of justice.
Right. And I just listening to what you said about, the Percy Green decision and your dad's role in it. It's like, it sounds like you are very much like him in that you were persistent and tenacious. And like when he told you to stop, you didn't, and that's
right.
That's kind of how he was.
Yeah, exactly. No, he would never want to admit that. But I was his carbon copy, and I have two brothers who, were not at all like him in that sense. I mean, they went into science and medicine. And so I was the only one who went into this world of storytelling. And, it's interesting because there's a number of very, very important civil rights attorneys from the 1960s and 70s, many of whom had children who became documentary filmmakers. So Liz Garbus, David Van Taylor, I mean, a bunch of us sort of followed in our father's footsteps, but didn't want to use the law as our method of change. We wanted to use storytelling as our method of change. The Kunstler girls, William Kunstler's daughters, both became documentary filmmakers. So it's almost like we have a little club. So.
All right. So Nina, can you explain to us how a story that you began to investigate about Howard Mechanic, who was a student protester convicted of a federal crime under this weird indictment, and unusual indictment, his disappearance, and then student protests in general, the civil rights movement, all this happening along with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and the FBI investigating various, leftist movements, et cetera. How did that story then migrate into a fascination in conspiracy theories? I mean,
Yeah, no, I mean, and I say it at the beginning of my fugitive, like right up at the top, I said, this sounds like, some kind of tin hat conspiracy theory. I'd sort of buy into the fact that all of this just sounds, too strange to be believed. I'm not particularly interested in conspiracies, oddly enough. I'm not, there are people, and I listen to some of the other, authors that are going to be contributing to this volume. And I thought, these are people who really have delved deeply into, people, sort of what do people believe? How do people believe it? What makes a conspiracy? I mean, all of these questions that, to be honest, have never interested me at all. And I tend to actually avoid them because I think they're sort of the stuff of having to deal with crackpots. So I, oddly enough, am not driven into this world of being interested in conspiracies. That said, I found myself smack dab in the middle of a true conspiracy and somehow just had to come to embrace that. And it got me thinking, not so much. I mean, I was thinking about our conversation even before, sort of earlier today. So I swim like 3-4 times a week. And sometimes I do my best thinking in the pool.
oh,
And so as I was doing my swim today, I was thinking, why does this exist for me? And I was, because I thought, I am sort of I'm not interested in conspiracies. I'm not, I don't want to believe them. I don't want to, debunk them. I just don't care. But when I became privy to a conspiracy that was so successful, I became interested in what are the elements of a successful conspiracy, and how was what I discovered, was that sui generis, or was it just something that that had all of the sort of the constellation, all of the stars aligned, such that you could actually have a conspiracy that was true. And so my work with you is about true conspiracies, because it's been verified in ways that I can, have a hard time believing, but I did it because I did it myself, being that dogged daughter of Lewis Gilden that I am. But I think so I became interested in what are the elements, because I am a historian, of what does it take to make a true conspiracy? Because we think about conspiracies in an almost pejorative way. Like we think about it, I mean, you say the word and immediately you think, well, now these days we think QAnon, or we think, people on Area 51, or we think, whatever it is, right? Crazy people. It's all very pejorative. But what about in the small number of cases where they're true? So I pushed myself to think, okay, well, what are the circumstances in which you can have a true conspiracy? Well, the mafia has successfully created many conspiracies that are true, right? But even that, those are the bad guys, right? That's, they're the mafia, they've got, the brotherhood, that, they've got, made men, they've got vows of silence, they've got all kinds of things. But this conspiracy, specifically having to do with the assassination investigation of Dr. Martin Luther King, was so broad and so successful that I needed to understand more.
Right. So, I loved everything you just said there. And particularly love the question that you have zoomed in on, which is, which historical contextual factors must exist for an actual conspiracy to obtain over a long period of time? And that's a great question. It's a good historical question. So I love it. And I don't know if any of us are actually asking that in particular. So I'm really grateful for your focus on that. But okay, so tell me if I got this right. You were able to, through various lawsuits, you were able to obtain access to, what did you say, 150,000 documents that had previously been top secret, and you gained access to them in 2018. Is that right?
So we filed the suit in 2015. We won in 2017, but that was just when I filed the lawsuit. I mean, prior to filing a FOIA lawsuit, I think I filed my first FOIA in 2013, maybe even 2011.
Okay.
This went on for the better part of a decade.
Oh, wow. And very few people have the time or energy or capability to continue.
Well, some people just don't live that long.
That's a long period of time.
Right. If I were to do that now, I'd be sort of hard pressed.
Shoot. And these are documents from the late 1960s, early 1970s. Yeah.
So initially my focus had been, I looked at, Howard Mechanic, some of the other, co-defendants. My father, I was interested in what did they know about my father. I was interested in Washington University, St. Louis, Missouri, 1969 to 1974. So all of this, kind of led to some documents being released. Something else that occurred that sort of blew it open is that there was a time in this, in like the 1980s, when people who had been involved in the movement, in the civil rights movement or the student movement, requested their FBI files. So it was kind of became like this thing to do. Like, it's like, oh, I got my FBI file. So I went to, because of my maiden name, which is Gilden, I went to lots and lots of people who had been at Washington University at that time. And I said, they knew my father because my father had represented so many of these students. And I said, I'm looking for people's, like, did you get your FBI files? So a number of people, probably 20 people, sent me their FBI files. And it was at that point that I started to see interconnections, patterns that were developing. But you have to realize that each one of these files, depending on, how active the person was, sometimes they were, 600, 700, 800 pages. And I would have to read every single one of these things, annotated, anyway, it was a very, very complicated matrix to create. But one of the things, and eventually when I hired an attorney, a guy named Jeffrey Light, who's, I'd say this, just without any bravado to it, but he is the #1 FOIA attorney in the United States. And he knew my father's work.
Okay.
And so he took the case pro bono.
Wow.
And knowing he was very confident that we would win, and he ultimately was paid by the government, because when you sue the government and you win, you get to, you get
they have to pay
reimbursed
for all the costs of the trials and everything, right?
Exactly. They paid for all of the legal fees for both, obviously themselves, but then also for us. But he was very confident in our case. But Jeff said, go. So I was, it's like, oh, I'm going to do all these people and all these subject matters and all of these, dates and, things that I knew about. Right. Well, Jeff said, no. Go to the bottom of these documents, all of the documents that you've gotten. And there are numbers. We are going to sue for every single one of those numbers. So a lot of these numbers, I would say 3/4 of them, There was probably 200 of them that I didn't know what they were, but what they were files. Those were file numbers, main file numbers for top secret files that had not been named in everybody's released file. So that information had been redacted.
Okay.
Well, we sued for everything.
Right.
Which is what led us to 358 separate FOIA requests. So out of all of that, these documents emerged. And I won't bore you with how, I looked at 150,000 pages of documents. But that was just one avenue. So where I got tipped off to the King connection was one day, and this sort of appears in the podcast. I typed in to one of these search engines because at that time I was making a film, right? So, I'm a filmmaker, it's what I do, I know how to do it well. So, but I'm always looking for footage. So there are these libraries that you can't go through Google. You have to sort of enter into them through different, through they're sort of singular in how you gain access to them. So I typed in St. Louis fugitive into one of these search engines, looking for footage. And up popped this man at a lectern who was talking about a conspiracy in St. Louis in 1967 and 1968 to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King. And I'm thinking, I go into my conspiracy theory, rejection mode. So, and I'm like, who the hell is this guy? So he's some crazy, and I couldn't tell, right? He's like this, this person, he's standing at a lectern, he's, talking about James Earl Ray, he's talking about the Ray brothers, he's talking about this bar, he's talking about all of this stuff. And I'm like, this guy is like, he's just, three sheets to the wind. So, but I'm like, okay, who the hell is this guy? So I start looking around, and it turned out he wasn't three sheets to the wind. He was a man named Robert Blakey. And Robert Blakey was the chief counsel for the House Committee on Assassinations. And what he was doing was reading into the record in this thing that I happened to find. He was reading into the record a portion of the committee's findings that they were concerned was going to be lost to history. And I'm like, So I'm like, this is happening. So King is assassinated April 4th, 1968. The beginning of what I found in St. Louis dated back to 1967, when J. Edgar Hoover started homing in on St. Louis, Missouri, for a reason that's I'm not going to get into here. But it became a crucible for many of the kind of civil rights, student activist, sort of repressive activities of not just the FBI, the CIA, the Department of the Army, the National Security Agency, a lot of different agencies. And there was a reason why it happened in St. Louis. But I thought to myself, I need to talk to this guy. So I'm like, is Robert Blakey still alive? Right?
First question.
First question. Okay, let's find this guy. So I, find him, I send him an email, Professor Blakey. It turns out he was a law professor at Notre Dame. He had written the RICO statutes, speaking of our friends, in the mafia. So an incredibly highly esteemed, criminal counsel, and taught at Notre Dame for many, many years. So I contacted him and I'm like, Professor Blakey, this is what I'm doing. And he says to me, sure, I'll talk to you. So I talked to him on the phone and he starts putting all of these pieces together and starts giving me a roadmap of things I need to start looking at in these documents. So now we've got a conversation going on between a live individual and these documents, which, it's like anything else. It's like, how do you read a document? Who's the author of the document? What is that person's, motivation? What is it they're trying to achieve? Where in the constellation of time, place, hierarchy does this document exist? So I'm like, I'm going to fly to Arizona, Scottsdale, Arizona, where Robert Blakey lives, and interview him right away, because I learned my lesson. I made a film about the great polio epidemics, and Jonas Salk died before I could interview him. And I learned never, ever, ever wait.
Yeah.
So I hop on a plane with my film crew and I walk into Professor Blakey's home, which is this beautiful home in Scottsdale. And in the foyer, he says, I've been waiting for 40 years for somebody to ask me these questions.
Oh my goodness. Wow. And 40 years later, he's able to, like you said, he's able to point you to documents without sort of condemning himself, because he's been sworn to secrecy, right? There are certain things that he's not allowed to say.
So everything that was in closed session is still secret.
Right.
Everything that where immunity grants were made is still secret. Everything where confidential informants were involved is still secret. And all of the depositions of the House Committee on Assassinations are still secret. And they are coming under review for release in 2027.
Okay.
So maybe in a few years,
Part two.
there'll be part two, maybe something for me to, do in my golden years. But point being is that he didn't know. I mean, he doesn't know what I have in my cache, but he's able to, but I know. So I'm able to query him
Right.
about people, places, again, sort of a kind of a grouping of people.
Right.
And the other thing is that, and it goes to the question of these conspiracy theories that have to do with both Kennedy and King, because the House Committee on Assassinations investigated both.
Right.
Now, I wasn't interested in the Kennedy assassination. That's like a whole other, like, let's like a whole other, like, country heard from. But in my world, the reason that the House decided to sort of finance and then do this investigation was because of the amount of conspiracies that were out there about both of these assassinations.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I was going to say, is that, I mean, almost immediately after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination was announced, there were a whole host of theories about what happened and the extent to which the government was involved. And so those theories persisted. Some gained ground, some didn't.
Right.
And so it just kind of zooming out a little bit on conspiracy theories in general, what they are essentially, as we've already discussed, are alternative theories that have not yet been accepted by the mainstream authoritative institutions. They're more on the outskirts. They're waiting to be accepted, but they haven't been yet, awaiting, I guess, more evidence or something. And so what it seems to me that happened to you is that you were aware of these alternative theories, and for you, they were not only alternative, but not really worth a lot of your attention, until you uncovered this evidence, which began to sort of illuminate the possibility that at least one of these alternative theories might be a correct theory.
And not only that, but actually not the dominant theory. I mean, that's the problem is that, I mean, especially in the King assassination, James Earl Ray never went to trial. He pled guilty, right? So that started the ball rolling.
So he pled guilty and then later denied that he did it, right?
3 days later.
3 days later.
Right. So he didn't wait long. And he said he recanted his plea.
See, it's similar to the JFK assassination. I mean, you can see why there were conspiracy theories that emerged from both of these, because, Harvey Lee Oswald also said, I didn't do it, I was set up.
Right. And so what you have is that you had, I mean, there was never a trial. James Earl Ray pled guilty in order to avoid the death penalty, the electric chair. 3 days later, he, sort of disavows his attorney, Percy Foreman, and he says, I didn't do it. And he spent the rest of his life contending that he did not do it.
Really?
Okay.
He never expressed his guilt after that?
No, never. So,
really?
So what this did was it spawned almost immediately a kind of a cottage industry of who did it, why did he do it, and here's the thing that really solidified the conspiracies around King's assassination. The King family came to believe that James Earl Ray did not do it. So you have this moment where Dexter King, son of the slain civil rights leader, goes to, Brushy Mountain Prison, shakes James Earl Ray's hand and says, we think you didn't do it.
Wow.
Now, if you don't think, and, a lot of this has to do with, African Americans' legitimate distrust of the government, especially in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, right? But it also, what had happened was that James Earl Ray had woven a story that he sold to a man named William Bradford Huey, that was published in Look magazine, that was sort of a kind of a tell-all, and he got $10,000 that actually paid for his defense. $10,000 that and they call it the 20,000 words, and it's this creation of James Earl Ray as to what really happened. And so what became the reigning paradigm was that James Earl Ray didn't do it. There was another shooter. James Earl was at the gas station getting the tire filled up. And that the shooter was this man named Raoul, who had made a stooge out of James Earl. Well, that has become the reigning paradigm. And even to this day, and I don't want to have anybody listen to other podcasts, but there's a podcast out there right now called the MLK tapes. That's like, James Earl Ray didn't do it.
Okay, wait, is the predominant narrative that James Earl Ray shot Martin Luther King Jr. all of his own accord, and then second place is that this guy Raoul did it? and James Earl Ray was a patsy or something.
Right. But here's what's happened is that the moment that the King family said that James Earl Ray didn't do it, I actually think the reigning paradigm is that, because that became the narrative.
Really?
That's the King family. That's what they believe. And so if you want to kind of say, oh, this was a conspiracy on, that the government has still never acknowledged, but it's simply not true. James Earl Ray, there was significant evidence. His thumb on, his thumbprint on the gun. I don't even want to go into all of the evidence, although I'm going to go into some of it. I'm going to go into some of it in my article for you, in my essay for you. But the fact is that what happened is
Wait, so this is, before you say this is based on all the evidence that you have since looked at. This is what you think happened.
It's not what I think happened.
This is what
the House Committee on, it's what the House Committee on Assassination knows happened.
This is based on the evidence.
These are not conspiracy theorists. This is the entire United States Congress.
Okay. All right. So lay it out. What did you discover? What happened?
So there was at the time of sort of in 1967, 1968, and even before then, there had been some bounties on Martin Luther King's head. Every once in a while, the White Citizens Council, blah, blah, there was all kinds of, sort of talk of getting rid of, of sort of the civil rights leader, and kind of get rid of what it was that he was doing. At that time, the FBI, around the time of the March on Washington, had decided to, and we have documentation of this, supplant Martin Luther King as the head of the civil rights movement with a person of their own choosing. Now, why J. Edgar Hoover ever thought he was going to be able to do this, and that, kind of the civil rights movement was going to just follow along behind, but they wanted King gone, right? There's no question about it. So already within the structure of law enforcement and kind of the machinations of what at that time were COINTELPRO, which was very, very active. And again, that's counterintelligence program. It was a program developed by J. Edgar Hoover successfully from essentially since 1945, from 1945 to 1971, COINTEL functioned against the civil rights movement, the student movement, the KKK. Actually, they were worried about the KKK because they're actually a little bit further to the right than J. Edgar Hoover, the Socialist Workers Party, Socialist Workers Party, and the Communist Party. So there was this active COINTELPRO against specifically Martin Luther King. They wanted him gone. They were going to supplant him. Around this time, there were these bounties on King's head. In 1967, the end of 67, the beginning of 1968, a bar in St. Louis opened called the Grapevine Tavern, owned by Harold Pepper and John Ray. Carol Pepper is James Earl Ray's brother. James Earl Ray's sister, and their brother, John. Though there were 9 members of the Ray family. James Earl was the eldest. And then there was a bunch of other sisters and brothers, but the closest to James Earl were Carol, John, and Jerry. Okay. So At this time, around this time, James Earl Ray is in the Missouri State Penitentiary. In April of 1967, he escapes in a bread box from the Missouri State Penitentiary. And he goes on this trip around, not just around the United States, but he goes to Mexico, he goes to Canada, he goes, he gets a nose job, he takes a bartending class, takes dancing lessons, he becomes a pornographer. James Earl Ray is lots and lots of different things are going on in James Earl Ray's life that he both, admits to and that are documented. At some point, he leaves Los Angeles, where he had been kind of hanging out for a while, and he heads to Atlanta. And he tracks Martin Luther King from Atlanta to Birmingham to Memphis, where he kills, where he finally assassinates Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968. In the world of the Grapevine Tavern, prior in 1967 and early 1968, there was one particular bounty that was made by a man named John Sutherland, who was a white supremacist in St. Louis, had been the head of the White Citizens Council, had formed what's known as the Conservative Citizens Council as well, sort of financed them, was a major player in the 1968 election of or candidacy of George Wallace for president that year. And the Grapevine Tavern became kind of a watering hole for this right-wing cabal. There are a number of connections between the Grapevine Tavern and James Earl Ray. I'm not going to go into all of those connections because they're very detailed. They're very, very convincing. And they were so, the bounty was so pronounced. And I just want to lead you through, it sounds like a lot of detail, but important detail. In May of, so James Earl Ray assassinates King and he flees and it's the second part of his fugitive journey. So the first part of his fugitive journey is when he escapes from the Missouri State Penitentiary, right? So he escaped in March, not April. March until March 1967 to April 1968, he's a fugitive. Missouri State Penitentiary, kind of not a big deal. Assassinates King. He flees. Most people don't know that James Earl Ray was not captured until 2 months later. And he was captured boarding a plane to London. Okay? So, boarding a plane in London, I'm sorry. He was on his way to Rhodesia, which at that point had a non-extradition, didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. So it was a white supremacist nation. Okay, so what we have is there's a point at which he's assassinated King and he's on the run, but they know who he is. Right. At first, they didn't even know who he was. They think he's Eric Galt. They think he's, William Harvey Lohmeyer. They think he's all kinds of other people. They finally find out that he's James Earl Ray. They go and they interview his cellmates at the Missouri State Penitentiary, where he had been, for quite some time. One of his cellmates on May 10th, 1968, before he's ever captured, which isn't until June 8th, a month later, he reports that James Earl had told him that a businessman's organization was that he was going to make big money, and it wasn't going to be from robbing banks, that a businessman's organization was going to pay him $100,000 to kill King, and that King was 5 years past his due. So this is before anything can be said by James Earl Ray. He's still on the run. The FBI knew that there was an intention by James Earl Ray to make good on a bounty. Wasn't $100,000, it was $50,000 that had been made by John Sutherland in the Buyer's Bounty that came through the Grapevine Tavern in St. Louis.
Right. So there's like layers of conspiracy here. There's, on one hand, there is a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King Jr. There are a group of associates that are trying to actively recruit someone to go kill him. Right. And
that's happening. That's happening in a variety of places. Right.
Yeah.
Happening in a variety of places.
Yeah. Right. And then on top of that, there's this other layer of conspiracy where J. Edgar Hoover and his administration within the FBI is trying to remove or depose Martin Luther King Jr. as head of Black Civil Rights Movement.
Exactly.
And
all that's documented.
As another piece, they know that there is this active bounty out there on Martin Luther King Jr. And they also came to find out about James Earl Ray, and they decided to hide those last two things. All three of those things from the American public. They didn't want us to know that Hoover was actively trying to depose King. They didn't want us to know the extent to which they were surveilling King or like trying to mess with his movement. They didn't want us to know about the bounties that they knew about or about James Earl Ray's connection to these other associates, right? Did I get that right?
100%. Very well, succinctly, you get it. That's the gold star moment right there, because it's and look, I mean, I think the important thing to know is, and again, that the American public did not know any of this.
No, they didn't
until 1978, when the House Committee on Assassinations, and we're talking now 10 years after King's death.
That's a long time.
That's a very long time. And it should have come up in 1975 during the Church Committee hearings, which was the Senate Select Committee that investigated the King assassination. They brought out certain things. There was reasons why this didn't come out. But it's the reason that that Robert Blakey said to me, I've been waiting for 40 years for somebody to ask me these questions, because what he was able to do was to put together for me what happened in St. Louis with the King assassination, COINTELPRO, and Howard Mechanic.
So let's end with the question we started with then, Nina. How is it that these layers of conspiracy have been sort of hidden from the public for so long? You said 40 years is a long time for us not to know the actual narrative of events. So that was your opening question. Like, how is it that true conspiracies are able to obtain for long periods of time? And what is your sense after studying this?
Well, I think that, a number of things. One is the FBI, was under J. Edgar Hoover, was impenetrable. It was impermeable. The people who worked on COINTELPRO didn't even, so say you were in, the Atlanta office of the FBI, and your charge was to look into, racketeering. You could be in an office and COINTELPRO was so secret inside of the FBI that you could be working in the Atlanta office and never know of what was, there were probably 100 agents assigned to Atlanta on the King COINTELPRO. There, So sometimes it would be behind a closed door in smaller offices.
Wow.
In Atlanta, I think they got like they initially were in a hotel room, and then they finally just, rented a separate office space where no one of those FBI agents were even allowed to tell their, like their coworkers where they were.
100 agents in one office alone. That's what Hoover
Office.
was willing to do to keep tabs on King.
That's just Atlanta.
That's an incredible amount of resources.
That's just Atlanta.
That's just Atlanta. And you talk
That's
all
just
about
it.
the St. Louis office in
We're
your
talking 36 offices around the nation, and all of them had COINTELPRO
oh my
activities,
goodness.
and especially the big cities, New York, Chicago. I mean, where the Black Panthers were. I mean, you think about the level of resources that were devoted to this, not just to the exercise, but to the secrecy.
Wow.
And J. Edgar Hoover, I mean, he was director of the FBI for nearly 50 years. I think it was 48 years. So the first thing that it takes to have a successful conspiracy is you have to have an impenetrable organization. And J. Edgar Hoover had that. He functioned, those COINTELPRO agents, those special agents functioned without any knowledge of even their own co-workers. So, I mean, that's item one.
Well, that's key. I mean, it's the same with the
Yeah.
Manhattan Project. You had all kinds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people working on the project, and they didn't realize they were building a nuclear weapon.
Right. And so here you have, you have, an active program that, and look, in 1968, was now not just going after the civil rights movement, the, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a bunch of other, Black militant organizations, but now they're launching on May 10th, just oddly enough, same date, May 10th, 1968, COINTELPRO New Left. They're going to take on the entirety of the youth movement. So, you think about that. And you think about the level of secrecy, and you think about the level of intricacy of and how it's how granular it was. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was involved in the daily lives of nearly every single one of his agents, as if he were, a hydra, But I have to say, so it takes, I think, first of all, the question of secrecy was absolutely critical. The second element to it was, I do believe, is that the King family, God bless them, I think their distrust of, especially after everything that came out about COINTELPRO, was so profound that they could, that if you believed in King, which we do. I mean, we made him, his birthday is a national holiday.
Oh yeah.
It feels peculiar, and I don't know how else to describe it other than peculiar, to somehow cross them on their beliefs about this. It's
so you're saying factor two is there's another narrative, there's an alternative narrative that has been captured by the sorts of people that we would believe in,
right. So we want to believe the King family,
right?
I mean, I want to believe the King family. I mean, they sacrificed so much for all of us.
Right.
But here's the thing, is that, there have been, and, I'm sure you're aware that there was a bill in Congress that hastened the the release of the Kennedy files.
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, there have been other bills like that for the King files as well. And the King family has steadfastly sort of rejected and impeded the release of hastening those files.
That's interesting.
And the reason is, and look, everyone is concerned about not just what's in those files about the FBI, but about what King was doing. I mean, the sex tapes, we all know about the sex tapes.
I know about those, yeah.
Right. With sex tapes, they sent, a sex tape to Coretta King.
Wife. Yeah.
Right. Suggesting that, he commit suicide, the suicide letter. So there have been at various times, and I point this out in my fugitive, in 1977, the Department of Justice did their own review. Right. So Congress is doing kind of their thing at the House, in the Senate and the House. The Department of Justice does their own review. And in their recommendations of the MLK task force, they recommend that all of the documents, memoranda, tapes, all of the fruit of the poisonous tree be destroyed before they can ever be released.
Oh, I can't get behind that, Nina.
I can't get behind it either. But the King family has steadfastly objected to the release. And I think it will affect, by the way, this 2027 review, because I think the heirs to the King legacy will continue to object to the release of this material.
Wow, that's just another interesting wrinkle in your whole project. Look, Nina, I am basking in the eloquence of your speech. This is like so compelling. I'm on the edge of my seat right now. And anyone who listens to this, I think, will be as well. But I have to go pick up my kid from school.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I feel like we ended up a little bit later than we were going to. Yeah. But, we have to, first of all, people should listen to My Fugitive.
They should.
Because, you get to hear more of my, terrible voice. But the other thing is that it's going to, they should read they should read Left in the Midwest, because that's, I really take a much deeper dive into what happened in St. Louis. Don't touch the King assassination material, but I'm going to do that for you.
Exactly. And I cannot wait to see what you come up with. Yeah, I really look forward to reading your draft. And thank you so much for spending this time with me.
Yeah, me too. Anytime. Always good to see you.
Let's talk again. All right. Bye, Nina.
Absolutely. Ciao, ciao.